Hi, I'm Ruth, one of the librarians at Thunder Bay Public Library. Today we are joined by Elle Andra-Warner, reading blah, blah, blah. Hi, my name is Ruth, and I'm one of the librarians at Thunder Bay Public Library. Okay. Hi, my name is Ruth, and I'm one of the librarians at Thunder Bay Public Library. Today we are joined by Elle Andra-Warner. Thank you.
Hi there. First of all, thank you to the Thunder Bay Public Library for inviting me to be part of these author readings. My name is Andra-Warner, as Ruth mentioned, and I'm an author, journalist, and columnist for about the last, about 30 years. I was born in Europe in a castle, a little bit about me, born in Europe in a castle, and for the first couple of years of my life, I was with my parents in a United Nations displaced persons camp for Estonians in Eckenförde, West Germany. We came to England and then we came to Canada in the 1950s. And basically I've been based in Thunder Bay since then, and except for a couple of years in Yellowknife in northern Alberta. So, and I've been started off writing feature articles, columns, things like that back, as I said, almost 30 years ago. And in 2003, I took on writing books for national publishers. So how did I happen to write about the autobiography of Robert Service? Well, I was a part of a group of writers that were authoring books for the general public for a Canadian publisher, and they asked if I'd write a book on Robert Service. Said yes, and the book has become a Canadian bestseller, and the latest reprint of it, from which I'm going to read, has just been launched by Canada's Heritage House Publishing. Now, what was extra special about the book, it's right here is the book with the little things on it so I can know where to go to read, was that Robert Service's granddaughter wrote the foreword for me. And I'm going to start the reading with that. So this is the foreword that Robert Service's granddaughter, who lives in France, wrote for me. Her name is Madame Anne Longepi, and this is what she wrote. Although I was only 6 years old when he died, his kind image is engraved on my childhood memories. He stays for me a good man, simple, sensitive, generous, passionate about the beauty of nature, and loving liberty very much. He loved to play with me and my sister when his work left him some time. His life philosophy is very simple. Freedom is heaven, lack of it, hell. As he wrote, let us grow happiness in our inner garden and make his motto ours. The motto, all is well. Now, so many people know about Robert Service and that he was up in the Yukon and things like that, and that he wrote poetry and that, but what was he like when he was a youngster? So this is from the prologue. At the age of 13, Robert Service had a burning desire to be a sailor. He fantasized about being a mariner on the high seas and spent every Saturday down at the docks admiring the ships. His parents, however, set out to diffuse this passion. When they insisted he would have to stay in school for another year, he vowed to be a terrible student. And he was. Robert made a point to arrive late in class. He ignored the lessons and drew caricatures of the teachers. When a teacher would ask him a question, he would give sassy answers to make the other students laugh. His defiant behavior made him a thorn in the side of authority, and the boy was on the fast track to being expelled. Then one day, simple childhood prank on his drill master, Sergeant William Walker, became the final straw. A retired soldier with 22 years' experience in Northumberland Fusiliers, Walker was a strict disciplinarian who had no time for jokes. Robert didn't care. When he's made master of the class's drill company for the day, he decided to have some fun. In a deep voice, he commanded his classmates to quick march, and then march them straight into the school washrooms. Everyone laughed, everyone, except Sergeant Walker. Robert's action merited a visit to the headmaster, who simply said to the boy, "Perhaps it might be better if you ceased coming." So at the age of 14, Robert's formal schooling ended. His teachers predicted he would be a failure in life, but Robert Service went on to become the most successful and likeliest the richest poet of the 20th century. So here's a little bit about his early years, the Scottish years. Perhaps, and maybe he came with this defiance, a little genetic predisposition. Perhaps unconventionality was in Robert William Service's life. He was born on January 16, 1874, in Preston, England, the eldest of 10 children. His father, Robert Service Sr., was from Kilwinning, Scotland, and his mother, Sarah Emily Parker, was from a wealthy English family that owned a cotton factory. His parents defied convention by eloping in 1872, when his father was 35 years old and his mother was 17. Emily's father, James Parker, was so furious that he severed all ties with him. The Services continued to break with tradition. When Robert William was born 2 years later, he was named after his father and his father's brother William, ignoring the Scottish custom of naming the firstborn son after the father's father, which would be John. Emily did reconcile with her father shortly before his death in 1875, and she was reinstated in his will. She inherited an annual income of £200, which was quite a lot in those days, prompting Robert Service to resign from his job Robert Service Sr., to resign from his job as a bank clerk and go into business for himself as a general commission and insurance agent. He failed, and in 1878 moved the family back to Glasgow area, settling in nearby Kilwinning, his hometown on the River Garnet. When he failed in business again as a commission agent, Robert Sr. decided his lifetime career would be to manage the family, which he did until he died in Canada over 30 years later. After moving to Kilwinning, Robert's parents brought him and his brother John Alexander to live with their 64-year-old grandfather, John Service, the town's postmaster and registrar, and their 4 unmarried aunts, Jeanie, Isabella, Agnes, and Janet. Robert never explained why he was sent to live with his grandfather, but it may have been to ease the parenting burden on his mother, who was expecting her 4th child. Whatever the reason, for the next 4 years, Robert lived in his grandfather's home and had little contact with his parents. His grandfather became the key influence in his young life. Robert had a sheltered childhood, one that included dedicated religious activity. His aunts, donned in their black silk skirts, would read religious writings by the fire. Their Victorian parlor was decorated with glossy black furniture, a grandfather thought, a bookcase of sermons, and a collection of wax fruit unglassed. A needlework picture of Moses in bulrushes hung on the wall. When Robert was 6 years old, his 37-year-old aunt Agnes died of consumption. He had thought she was the loveliest of aunts and the loneliest. She was often sad, sat apart from the family. Robert later surmised that she forced this solitude upon herself because she didn't want to infect the others. Agnes was a poet, and on one occasion she shared her work with her young nephew. She brought out some delicately written poems, Robert recalled later. She said they were her own, and I thought them beautiful. Agnes died on November 14, 1880, and Robert visited with her the night before she passed. She smoked her herbal cigars and hugged him tightly. He always remembered the unearthly brightness of her eyes, as he said, the last time he saw her. She was regarded as doomed, wrote Robert years later. We just waited for her to die. I did not understand then, but now I realize how stoically she awaited death who had never really known life. It was his first experience with death. Robert's Aunt Jeanie encouraged him to learn poetry and recite long narrative poems. Mounted on a chair in the parlor, he would do readings of dramatic poems like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's classic, The Wreck of the Hesperus. Robert wasn't the only one in the family destined to be recognized in literature. His cousin, Dr. John Service, would gain literary acclaim with books like The Life and Recollections of Dr. Dogood of Kilwinning and the Memorials of Robin Hunter. Born in Kilwinning in 1851, Dr. Service later moved to New South Wales, Australia, where he died in 1913. Robert's uncle William became a classics master at the exclusive girls' school, and his brother Dr. Stanley Service wrote poetry. The Service family also talks about his distant kinship with the great Scottish poet Robert Burns. Robert's first recital of his own work took place on his 6th birthday. A special dinner had been prepared for him, including cold boiled ham, cookies, cakes, and scones. When his grandfather was about to say grace, Robert blurted out, "Please, Grandpa, can I say grace this time?" And then, before anyone answered, he began, "God bless the cakes and bless the jam. Bless the cheese and cold boiled ham. Bless the scones Aunt Jeannie makes, and save us all from belly aches. Amen." Everyone in the room was silent. Suddenly, Robert was afraid he would be punished for his boldness. But his fear was short-lived. His family was delighted and praised his cleverness. They talked about his grace for years. Robert lived with his grandfather and aunts until he was 9 years old. His aunts wanted to adopt him, but his mother was adamant in her refusal, and in 1883 brought him to their family home in Hillhead, just outside of Glasgow. 4 years later, his grandfather died at the age of 76. Now back with his family, Robert reacquainted himself with his siblings and settled into his new surroundings. For a while, he attended church school along with future notables. A quick and witty, ferocious reader, Robert was a free spirit who couldn't help but spout convention. After he was expelled from school at the age of 14, he worked for a time in the shipping office and then asked his father to help him find work in the bank. Thanks to his father, Robert began his banking career with the Commercial Bank of Scotland in the summer of 1888. For the next 8 years, he worked as an apprentice, earning £20 a year. During that time, Robert became passionate about poetry, carrying on books by Tennyson and Browning, and studying verse makers such as Thackeray and Tom Hood. He even read while he walked. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, and we're going to start where his feelings of wandering. Where did he get this idea to be a wanderer? Well, it was George Barrow's Llangor introduced Robert to the gift of vagrancy and led him to question the wisdom of a banking career. Did he really want a 40-year future of desk work in tellers' cages? Morley Robertson of Western Avenue also awakened the spirit of he called it vagabondage, in Robert. Now barely 20 years old, he made a life-altering decision. He would go to America and become a hobo. While Robert was able to imagine countless exciting adventures in America, the reality was that he was an overweight banker still living with his parents. His brother Peter, who had become physically fit while working on the farm, even called him the little fat banker. Determined to lose weight, Robert took up weightlifting, went on long walks every day, and adopted a fresh outlook on life. He also developed a plan. As soon as he got enough money, he would quit the bank and be a farmer. When Peter suggested he move to Canada, Robert visited the Canadian Immigration Office to find out more. After doing some research, he became an authority on the country. He pictured himself as a cattle rancher on the Canadian prairies, riding broncos, roping steers. The rugged romanticism of a cowboy life was calling him. He bought a big hunting knife and an air pistol, and for hours would practice the fast gun draw. Though anxious to start his adventure, he still lacked the money. Then fate intervened. The bank increased his bank from 20 to 70 pounds, gave him more money to save for his Canadian journey. They also transferred him to another branch and gave him a reference letter testifying to his intelligence, willingness, and industry. On March 31st, 1896, Robert took on the challenge of adventure and resigned from the bank. He was 22 years old and told his 47-year-old manager that he wanted a free life. McKinnon, the manager, looked out the window longingly and replied, "I only wish I had your years, then by God, my lad, I'd go with you." So we're gonna move ahead a little bit, and he does leave. He does leave Scotland. He sees his father for the last time at the dock before he leaves, and we're gonna move forward to when he is back in Canada. So I'm going to just move ahead here, and he's already in Whitehorse, and we're going to start where he's gets to do his first he's got adventures before that, but before his first things. And this is in Whitehorse, when he was a bank teller in Whitehorse. He's already lived in Vancouver Island. Within a year, Robert was promoted to bank teller, had saved $1,000, and was active in the Whitehorse social scene. He successfully produced a play called The Area Ballad, and was known around town for his lively recitations of ballads such as Casey at the Bat and The Face on the Barroom Floor. When Robert was asked to recite at a church social, the editor of the Whitehorse Star, Elmer White, suggested he present one of his own compositions. Robert thought about it as he went for one of his long woodland walks. He liked the idea of writing a dramatic ballad recitation, but struggled to come up with a theme. Then one Saturday night, while he was walking by the busy and noisy bar scene, the ballad's opening line suddenly appeared in his mind. A bunch of the boys were looking it up. He quickly walked back to the bank building, crept downstairs to his teller's cage, and started work on his ballad. But disaster was looming. The ledge keeper in the guardroom thought Robert was a burglar, and he shot at him. As Robert later wrote in his autobiography, quote, "Fortunately, the ledge keeper was a poor shot, or the shooting of Dan McGrew might never have been written. Anyhow, with the sensation of a bullet whizzing past my head and a detonation ringing in my ears, the ballad was achieved." Robert wrote the ballad as if the spirit was dictating to him. It flowed effortlessly, stanza after stanza. Exhausted, he finally, at 5 a.m., finished it and went to bed. He had written the ballad to recite at the church concert, but in the end couldn't use it because it had too many cuss words. So he put it away in a drawer. A month later, Robert heard a strange tale about a man being cremated in an abandoned boat. According to those who knew Robert at the time, the story was told to him by the town's doctor, Leonard Doc Sugden. The doctor had gone to attend an old Swede who was seriously ill on the shores of Lake Labarge, about 50 kilometers north of Whitehorse. The Swede was already dead when Sugden had reached him, and being alone, the doctor couldn't bring the man's body back all the way to Whitehorse. Nearby on the shore was an old derelict steamer called the Olive Main. Sugden claimed he had disposed of the body by putting it in the boiler of the old boat and cremating the old Swede. Robert had listened intently to the man who cremated the Swede, and later wrote of the moment, "I had a feeling that here was a decisive moment of destiny." Indeed, the doctor's story would soon become immortalized in one of Robert's greatest ballads, The Cremation of Sam McGee. Writing this ballad came easily to Robert. "I took the woodland trail, my mind seizing with excitement in a strange ecstasy," he said in his autobiography. "As I started in, there are strange things done in the midnight sun." Verse after verse developed with scarce a check. For 6 hours I tramped those silver glades, and when I rolled happily into bed, my ballad was cinched. Next day, with scarcely any effort of memory, I put it on paper. My moonlight improvisation was secure, and though I did not know it, McGee was to be the keystone of my success. The two ballads, The Shooting of Dan McGrew and The Cremation of Sam McGee, would become the most famous and most recited ballads in modern history. Robert's imagination was now swirling, creating new verse every day. His ballads told powerful stories with drama and humor. He was inspired by the people he met, the stories he heard, and the landscapes he walked. After creating his ballads, Robert would file each one, and according to his memoirs, forget about them, saying, "Writing was just a diversion, maybe a foolish one. I did it with no thought of publication." In late 1906, Robert gathered his poems into a manuscript and gave them to a Mrs. D. Guest to read. She suggested he get them printed as books of verse to give to friends. He called his little books Songs of a Sourdough. He liked alliteration, and it seemed a fitting title as he now was officially a sourdough, which is someone who has seen the Yukon River freeze in the fall and thaw in the spring. He then looked to Toronto for a publisher that would print the books for $100. By this time, his family was living in Toronto after having immigrated to Canada the previous year. Robert sent the manuscript plus his check for $100 to his father in Toronto to bring to the Methodist Book and Publishing House for printing. The company was the largest book publisher in Canada at the time and was headed by William Briggs. Robert's manuscript reached Briggs in December, and he was impressed. He arranged for a set of Galloway proofs of Song of the Sourdough to be given to his salesman, Robert Bond, who was about to leave by train on his annual Western sales trip. Briggs apparently told the 23-year-old Bond to try to sell some of Robert's work. Bond was already packed, but at the last minute shoved the proofs into his pocket. On the train, while sitting in the dining car, he remembered the proofs and he read them. He laughed out loud as he read them. The poems were so unusual, so Canadian. A neighboring diner asked Bond to read him the poems. Later in the smoking car, Bond recited the cremation of Sam McGee to a crowd of passengers, and they loved it. The first stop for over on the Western train was in Fort William, which is now part of the city of Thunder Bay, a small frontier town at the time on the western shore of Lake Superior. Bond decided to see if he could interest the local bookseller, John Mackenzie, in ordering copies of Songs of a Sourdough. The salesman walked a short distance from the Canadian Pacific Railway station on Hardisty Street to Platt and Mackenzie, a fancy goods and jewelry store on Simpson Street. Mackenzie had given him an hour to show his wares in the sample room. When Bond mentioned a new book of Canadian poetry, Mackenzie said, "We'll skip that," but added that he would consider the more saleable poetry collections like Drummond's Habitat poems. Bond returned to the store later and again asked Mackenzie about the new poetry book. To his surprise, Mackenzie responded, "Is this the poetry you were reading on the train to some travelers? They told me about it." Bond said yes and started reciting the cremation of Sam McGee, but stopped when customers came in. The bookseller then ordered 5 copies, giving Fort William, which is now the city of Thunder Bay, the honor of becoming the world's first place to buy Songs of Sourdough. So I'm going to move ahead now a little bit. There's all kinds of exciting stuff in the book, but I'll start with going to where he comes back and he sees his family for the first time in many, many years. Robert was seeking adventure, something different, but didn't find it in New Orleans. At this time, he had gone to New York, to New Orleans. He walked actually from New York quite a distance toward New Orleans, trying to get his novel that he had written, The Trail of the 98, to be published, which it did. Back to the reading. Robert was seeking adventure, something different, but didn't find it in New Orleans. He went on to Havana, Cuba, but became bored and longed for the snow and tonic air of the North. By chance, he came across an article in an American magazine titled, the title of the article, "I Had a Good Mother." Then he had an idea. He would go visit his own mother. "Suddenly I thought," said Robert, "I too had a perfectly good mother. She was living in Alberta, and I had not seen her in 13 years. Robert's father had died in January 1909, but not before seeing the success of Songs of a Sourdough. Robert decided his next adventure would be to get to know his family again. The family had moved to a homestead in Scottstown, Alberta, and that's where he headed. It was a cold winter day in February 1911, Robert surprised his family by knocking on the farmhouse door, pretending to be a salesman. Of course, his charade didn't please his mother. "Well, if it isn't our Willie," she said. He spent the next 3.5 months on the service homestead, getting to know his family again. Still at home were his 3 sisters, Agnes, Jane, and Janet, and 3 of his 6 brothers, Stanley, Peter, and Albert. Eventually, Stanley would go to medical school and be a doctor. Peter would head to Vancouver to open a second-hand shop, and Albert would be killed overseas while fighting in the First World War. In the spring of 1911, the need for travel and adventure prompted Robert to explore Alberta on foot. He covered 320 kilometers, stopping each night in Norwegian, Romanian, Slav, or French settlements. But this still wasn't enough to satisfy his wanderlust. Canada's north was drawing him like a magnet. He had to go back one more time to finish writing about the area. This time he wanted to return to Dawson City via the same gold rush route the Klondikers had traveled between 1898 and 1899. He would take the 3,200-kilometer Edmonton Trail to Dawson City, traveling the waterways of Athabasca, Slade, and Mackenzie rivers to the Arctic, and then down the Bell, Porcupine, and Yukon rivers to Dawson City. This all-Canadian water route to the Klondike was half the distance of the American route. Before now, Robert had created his ballads about the rigors of the North while sitting in a comfortable cabin. Now he would actually live as the Klondikers and wilderness adventurers have. He was 37 years old and in good health, but was the bank clerk turned poet and ready to be a real rugged northerner. As it was, he had quit his job at the bank in 1909. He never worked again. He lived off the royalties as he's going traveling around his traveling adventures. He went on his trip back up. He went to Athabasca Landing. He canoed the Mackenzie River, Fort McPherson, Dawson City. But when he left the Yukon this last time in 1912, I believe it was, he never went back again. He was part of the First World War Ambulance Brigade. He worked for the Toronto Star as a reporter. He got married, visited Russia, Estonia, just as the Second World War started. So we're going to skip ahead now to the First World War years. Second World War years. And they have just left England after being in an apartment after living in France. They lived in France, but they moved to England when the war started, and now they're leaving again. The intense bombing raids on London began on August 24, 1940. 2 weeks later, the London apartment where the services had been living was destroyed. Fortunately, they were no longer there. They had already fled England. The family left England on July 26 aboard the Princess Helene, a 4,000-ton Canadian Pacific steamship headed for Montreal. The steamer normally sailed between St. John, New Brunswick, and Digby, Nova Scotia, but when the war was declared by Canada in 1939, Canadian Pacific offered all its ships to the war effort. Some, like the Princess Helene, were converted to troop ships. Along with the services, the Princess Helene was carrying over 1,000 evacuated children and a contingent of Royal Air Force cadets traveling to Alberta for flight training. The first 3 days crossing the Atlantic were harrowing. The Princess Helene and his destroyer escort dodged enemy submarines, and life jackets were worn by everyone at all times, day and night. On the 4th day, the destroyer headed back to England, having escorted the Princess Helene to a safe zone. The media were waiting for Robert when they arrived in Montreal on August 1st. Reporters clamored to talk to the famous poet, eager to get his comments on escaping from France. His return to Canada unleashed frenzied media activity, perfect publicity for the Canadian edition of Barroom Ballads. From Montreal, the services traveled to Toronto and stayed there for a couple of days, then visited with Robert's brother Stanley and his family in Ottawa. The services then continued by train to Jasper, Alberta, where they relaxed in a log cabin, walked around Lake Hubert, and toured Moline Canyon. In September 1940, when the Services were still in Jasper. The real Sam McGee died in Basehor, Alberta. Once the media heard about McGee's death, they bombarded Robert with questions. Robert commented that Sam McGee had been a very fine type of sourdough prospector. The cremation of Sam McGee had brought different kinds of fame to both men, and it seemed fitting that Robert should attend McGee's funeral. Reports said he arrived late, slipped quietly into the back during the funeral service, having first gone to the wrong church. The services arrived in Vancouver on October 20th, 1940. Media continued to seek out the 66-year-old poet for interviews and photographs. Indeed, the return of Vancouver's famous former resident was big news. The family rented Tudor Manor on Sylvia Court and settled in for the next few months. Robert took pleasure in reuniting with his sister Agnes and brother Peter, who now owned a sourdough bookshop on Vancouver's West Ender Street. Robert was enjoying his time in Canada, but he never went back to visit the Yukon. He had left 38 years before. Some stories have surfaced that in August 1940 he did fly to the Yukon with Southern Air Transport, but most researchers say he did not. In Vancouver, he openly voiced his opinion about the Second World War and discussed how he missed being in France. I feel like as if I'm shirking something. After living for a year in the war zone, you get used to the atmosphere. Every moment is exciting. He longed to be either in France or in sunny California. He had spent time when he was doing his adventures in California. So after spending Christmas in Vancouver with his relatives, Robert and his family headed to Hollywood. For the next 5 years, the services maintained dual residences. They wintered in Hollywood and returned every spring to Vancouver. Meanwhile, the press continued to seek Robert out. At one point, he told reporters, "It seems as if the Yukon ballads were written by another man. I remember little of the Yukon, or what I wrote there." When asked what his advice was to emerging poets, he said, "Write verse, not poetry. The public wants verse. If you have a talent for poetry, then don't try by any means to smother it, but try your hand in verse." Robert continued to tackle new projects. He did his first radio broadcast in 1941, and he delivered his first public speech on November 12th to the Hollywood Author Society. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December, bringing the United States into the Second World War, Robert was in California and immediately joined the war effort. For 5 months, he traveled to the southwestern United States touring army camps, performing at concerts and talking to the troops. Whenever he recited the shooting of Dan McGrew or the cremation of Sam McGee, there was thunderous applause. Always ready for a new venture, Robert then became a Hollywood movie star. It all started when Frank Lloyd, who produced the 1928 film adaptation of Robert's book The Pretender, asked Robert if he would play himself in the film The Sailors. It was a story about an Alaska gold rush from a book written by Rex Beach. Leading stars would be Marlene Dietrich, Randolph Scott, and John Wayne. Robert only had 27 words to speak in the movie, but he practiced them intensely. He even hired a drama coach who told him not to make any gestures and to keep his face expressionless. The outfit he chose for his movie role as himself made him look like a cross between a miner, a cowboy, a roughneck, and Billy the Kid. Makeup artist John Pierce made Robert look 37 years younger, using as a reference a tintype photograph taken of him when he was a bank clerk in Whitehorse. Working with Marlene Dietrich was a big thrill for Robert, who later wrote of the experience. "Then from behind me a vision of sizzling beauty, the divine Dietrich. She wore a gown of gold, and she looked at me with her ice blue eyes thrilled me to my marrow." The Spoilers, the only movie that Robert ever appeared in, premiered in 1942 and received great reviews. By the end of October 1943, Robert had started another monumental work, the first book of his biography, Common of the Moon. A year later, he finished and sent the 1,000 of the 150,000 word manuscript to his publisher. He later wrote, During the whole year, I worked hard on my book. It was tough going at first, for the dragnet of memory did not prove too rich in glittering trove. I toiled valiantly, however, and pictures of the remotest past came to reward me. From the murk and gloom, scenes vivid and vital projected themselves, and triumphantly I pounced on them. Bit by bit, I filled in the frame of my tapestry, thinking, what a marvelous thing is visual memory. How was it I could reconstruct an event of 60 years ago as if it was yesterday? Yet there it was, incredible as a photograph preserved by some magical process of the mind. Memories of his father were particularly meaningful to him, and he dedicated the book to the memory of my father, adding a couplet. Full of rich earthiness, a grand old guy, with all his faults, a better man than I. Even as a biographer, Robert remained a storyteller extraordinary, embellishing stories, omitting dates, changing names, and adding imaginative details and people to move the story along. Future biographers would find it a challenge to sort out the storytelling from the non-fiction. One reviewer in 1945 said, Robert's service concentrates on news and impression rather than on names, facts, or figures. Thus, a reader of his biography might easily suppose that he was pursuing the vague memories of a literary vagabond, rather than those of an author whose ballads had netted him a substantial fortune and have for nearly 40 years been as familiar as Shakespeare to millions of people. With the war over, Robert and his family left Hollywood in December 1945 and headed for New York. Robert pulled some strings with senior executives to get passage to the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, a troop ship on the Bardstown Victory, a troop ship bound for Marseilles. At the time, he was almost 72 years old, a famous and wealthy poet who had lived for the past 50 years on his royalties. So Robert's most prolific writing was yet to come. In the last 9 years of his life, between the ages of 77 and 84, Robert would write more poetry than he had ever written before. Starting with Songs of a Sun Lover in 1949, he would publish 8 new volumes of work before his death in 1958. He made one more trip to Canada, and that was in 1948 for the International Sourdoughs Association in August in Vancouver, but it would be the last time he would be in Canada. The trip exhausted him, and he died in 1958. I hope you do get to read the book. He was a fascinating man. He's an adventurer. He's a wanderlust. And he lived off of his royalty for 50 years from poetry. Amazing story. Robert Service, there he is. Thank you. Thank you for the reading. I hope you enjoy it.